So now we'll move on to section 1.6, Unity, Variety, and Balance. These are the three central principles that artists use to create visual impact in their compositions. Unity is a sense of cohesiveness or oneness, of things coming together to make a coherent whole, or of the individual parts working together to communicate an idea, message, or feeling. In the visual arts, the principle of unity refers to a harmonious organization or order of the visual elements within a work. Variety is the opposite or complement of unity. It refers to visual diversity or difference of elements and objects within a work. The principle of variety can create visual interest and excitement. However, unity and variety are not exclusive. They can coexist. Variety can serve to unify a work by bringing together ideas, media, and elements. But a discordance of variety can create an uneasiness between the visual elements. Balance is the distribution of elements, whether they are unified or varied, within a work. It's a way of combining or arranging elements to create or destroy the feelings of equilibrium or stability within a composition. So all three principles, unity, variety, and balance, work in conjunction with each other. A work that has unity but no variety can be seen as boring. Unity and variety but no balance can cause a work to feel sort of off or uneasy and awkward. But variety and balance with no unity can result in a disconnected composition. For example, we're looking at three diagrams of compositional unity here. A is unified, but not quite as visually interesting as B. Yet C, while still unified, is a bit too visually varied. The number of differences in shape and things cause it to seem a bit chaotic or incoherent. So too much similarity of shape, color, line, or really any single element in a composition can cause the viewer to lose interest, but too much variety can cause a lack of structure and confusion, or perhaps a distraction from or even the absence of the central idea. So really the artist must learn to manage all three principles in order to create a successful composition. Now, unity is a sense of cohesiveness, oneness, of things coming together to make a coherent whole. Compositional unity is based on the organization of elements and principles within a composition. And elements and principles such as shape, line, color, etc. The French artist Yves Klein began creating monochromatic paintings in 1947 and continued to do so until his death in 1962. He thought of these as a way of rejecting the idea of representation in painting and as a means of attaining creative freedom. So according to the Tate Museum, which I'll post that link on Blackboard for you, in 1957, Klein trademarked International Klein Blue, or IKB, this pure ultramarine hue, and then he created an industrial paint in this color. So industrial paint consists of pigment powder in a synthetic resin, which allows the pigment to really maintain its intensity, and it creates a matte finish. So Klein then maximized the sort of incandescence of IKB by mixing it with a fixative that would evaporate almost entirely, and then he applied it with a roller to his canvas, which was treated with a milk protein called casein to help with adherence. So when dry, the pigment seems to sort of hover over the surface, and it adds a rich, velvety surface texture and an unusual sense of depth. So the unifying elements here in this composition are color as well as texture. Both are consistent across the canvas. It's not a complicated composition, which makes it easier to achieve unity. But remember, if a composition is too simple, it runs the risk of losing the interest of its viewers. Variety provides interest, which I think is achieved with the additional texture of the canvas here, kind of built up in these various ridges and things. So we have a sense of unity with the texture created, but it's not the same by any means from side to side. Klein is also relying on the intensity of this color for visual interest, though. He's quoted as saying, "I thus seek to individualize color, for I have reached the conclusion that each color expresses a living world, and I express these worlds in my painting. My paintings affirm the idea of absolute unity in the context of perfect serenity, and an abstract concept represented in an abstract manner." So we could certainly talk about this color, IKB, and its emotional or psychological qualities. And again, I'll post that Tate link for you, and it does talk about the emotional and psychological effect that Klein saw in this IKB. So we talked about Barnett Newman's Vir Heroicus Sublimis in terms of color, but let's go back and talk about unity, variety, and balance in this work. So Newman has achieved unity with color, with this uniform red hue across the canvas, but he's added some variety to the monochrome composition with subtle value variations, as well as those contrasting zips. And a difference in line quality as well, I would say. Some of these zips are more hand brushed, so a bit sketchier, whereas others are taped and so very straight and precise. And then the composition is balanced as well. It's not a complicated composition again, so balance is easier to achieve, I suppose, but the zips are varied across the composition, but visually balanced as well, kind of dividing it into an even set of thirds, I think. El Natsue is a Ghanaian sculptor, but he's active mostly in Nigeria. He transforms simple everyday materials into these impressive large-scale installations. Now, throughout his career, he's used a variety of materials, including ceramics and wood, but more recently, he's been making these large metal cloths or tapestries. Now, the Ewe word gau that's G-A-W-U, is their word for metal, as well as the word for a fashioned cloak. And El Anatsui says that this encompasses this medium. So you can watch the video that I'll post on the Blackboard page to learn more about El Anatsui's metal tapestries. But for these, he uses discarded metal fragments, sometimes bottle tops or pieces of cans, things like that. He's exploring ideas of reuse, of consumption and transformation, as well as ideas of ethnic identity by combining traditional African techniques of making and African imagery with abstraction and materials from everyday African life. He once said, "I saw the bottle caps as relating to the history of Africa in the sense that when the earliest group of Europeans came to trade, they brought along rum originally from the West Indies that then went to Europe and finally to Africa as three legs of a triangular trip. The drink caps that I use are not made in Europe, they are all made in Nigeria, but they symbolize bringing together the histories of these two continents." So what are the unifying elements of this work? How about texture? We've got the sort of metal surface texture all the way across the composition, variation of texture perhaps as well in the sort of wrinkles and in the way that it catches the light and reflects differently. What else? Perhaps also scale, considering that all of the smaller individual bottle caps used in this composition are of similar scale. And then we have, again, the reflective quality, but variety in these things as well. Variety in texture, reflection. How about variety of color with the variation of red, white, yellow, variety of line with the draping, really a lot going on here. So on one hand, it's sort of a simple composition, but on the other hand, it's varied and very visually interesting as well. I think very well balanced between the two. So here we have a work by the artist Katsushika Hokusai, and this is his Great Wave Off the Shore at Kanagawa from the 1826 to 33 series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. It is a woodblock print, which we'll talk more about the style of printmaking in part 2 of this course. But a woodblock print that depicts Mount Fuji, the largest mountain in Japan, which is considered a symbol of the country and a sacred place and kind of sacred image to both Buddhist and Shinto believers in Japan. But let's think about this composition in terms of unity, variety, and balance. So the artist here has achieved unity through the organized repetition of shapes, colors, textures, and patterns. The repetitions visually link different parts of the scene. Mount Fuji's form almost blends into the waves here because of the similarity of triangular shape, as well as the similarity of color. The white snow cap on Mount Fuji sort of mimics the white caps of the waves. And the shape and placement of the boats creates a pattern, which we'll talk more about pattern in another lecture, but creates a pattern, as do the repeated lines of the waves on the right side of the composition and the lines of the wave tips, the kind of foamy texture that they create there. Now, the great wave on the left not being repeated, it gives it sort of this visual strength over the rest of the composition. The careful arrangement of the various solid and empty forms and spaces, or perhaps you could think of them as positive and negative shapes or spaces, either way, creates a balanced area of visual interest across the composition. So the great wave kind of curls over this empty space below it, creating this contrast between solid and void, full and empty space, which adds variety and demands visual attention. And then the small size of the mountain really makes the wave seem even larger and even stronger. And then the artist has also added variety with color as well as the implied texture, size, etc. So even though this scene is perhaps a bit chaotic, Hokusai has created a unified composition through the organization and repetition of shapes, colors, textures, and patterns to create a visually harmonious composition. Your book points out that where the wave and the sky meet in this composition, it creates the shape of sort of an abstracted yin and yang symbol. So in the Taoist belief, there are forces that may seem opposed, but they're actually dependent on each other, and that is represented by the yin and yang. So we sort of have this symbol of unity and variety working together. They seem opposite, but they work in conjunction with one another. And then this also introduces the idea of conceptual unity, which refers to the cohesive expression of ideas within a work. So artists can use the elements, such as form, shape, color, etc., to communicate a concept, idea, or message. So what ideas are being expressed here? Well, we have Mount Fuji in the background, and remember I said it's sacred to both the Buddhist and Shinto religions. It's an active volcano, and it's believed to house an especially powerful kami, or spirit. Um, and she's believed to be especially powerful, even though the mountain last erupted in about 1708. Now, Mount Fuji here is really the only part of the composition that's not in motion. It sort of serves as the stabilizing force against the contrasting waves that overlap in diagonal and curving directional lines to imply a fierce thrashing motion. The boats thrash in the water in contrast to the eternally still form of Mount Fuji. These waves and boats sort of seem to go to work against each other, but in reality they move together as well. We could also break this down further and consider the idea of man versus nature, focusing in on these people aboard the boats who are facing the danger of the sea. And we could again refer back to that Taoist idea of yin and yang. We have this harmonious balance of seemingly opposites throughout the composition, but it serves to highlight the sacredness of the mountain as well as the balance and harmony between nature and humanity. So when a work has both compositional unity and conceptual unity, we get Gestalt Unity. So the idea of Gestalt Unity comes from a German word for form or shape. And so this idea is that the composition as well as the ideas are unified. So it results in a whole that appears to be greater than the sum of its parts. So the individual forms, shapes, etc. of a work are so completely unified in both composition and concept that they do not appear to stand alone or distract from the larger whole, but rather emphasize it. So here, both composition and concept are unified in communication of yin and yang, balance of nature, and humanity. Conceptual unity can also function more independently. A work can depend less on the elements for unity, and rather it can depend more on images or forms that relate to a single subject or idea. For example, to convey the idea or feeling of flight, an artist might use symbols like feathers, kites, balloons, etc. Each of these has different visual attributes, but all of them have a common idea, and when placed together, that idea is emphasized. So we're looking at Joseph Cornell's The Hotel Eden, simply Untitled, from 1945. Cornell was a surrealist sculptor who created these shadow box style collages using found objects. And typically they're quite suggestive of these mysterious ideas and elusive feelings. They're rather ambiguous in meaning, which is very surrealist. They were interested in diving into the unconscious and kind of the depths of the psychological. So here, Cornell is using the diversity of shapes, colors, etc., all in these everyday items in combination with one another to create his image. He's used this bird that's sort of evocative of flight or perhaps the idea of freedom, yet he's contained it within this shadow box. So in a way, it's sort of protected, but on the other hand, it's also trapped. It can't live up to its purpose. It can't fly. And then we also have sort of above and behind this ball that's balanced on two rails. However, it's positioned just so that it cannot roll in either direction. So it too is also trapped. So in combination with each other, the bird and the ball, the idea of entrapment or the lack of freedom is sort of intensified. So in his work, Cornell has fused and purposely confused memories, dreams, visualizations, etc., to create this sort of visually complex expression of his own inner mind, his feelings, and his personality. So this is contemporary artist Alfredo Jarre's Geography Equals War from 1991. This installation is an illustration of a story of the Nigerian farmer whose name was Sunday Nana. He was from Koko, Nigeria, and he was persuaded to store 8,000 55-gallon drums of toxic waste on his land for a rental fee of about $100 each month, which adds up to $1,200 per year, which is considerably more than Nigeria's annual income, or at least it was at the time. But these 55-gallon drums of toxic waste were often dented, and they were deposited on an unguarded dirt lot owned by Sunday Nana off of Koko's only paved road and only 200 meters from from the town's only school. Now, the barrels were marked with the skull and crossbones symbol that indicated they were toxic. However, they were often dented and would leak into the soil, and others that weren't dented, the pressure of the vaporized fluids within them caused the barrel to swell and then leak. So eventually the toxic waste seeped into the groundwater. And even though they were marked as toxic with the skull and crossbones, many of them were still emptied and taken by various citizens for personal use. So since this event, there have been many reports of severe chemical burns, premature births, and 19 deaths from the consumption of contaminated rice, which would have been stored in the barrels or maybe grown in the area, etc. So, how does Jarre's work use the separate elements to come together to communicate the issues here? How do the various elements of this installation come together as a whole? Well, first we have these light boxes that are set up as sculptural freestanding forms. And on one side, they have maps that illustrate the journey of the waste that was transported from Italy to Koko, Nigeria. Now, these are Peter's projection maps, which they're different from the usual map that we're probably used to seeing in school and things. But this type of map distorts the shape of the country, but allows the size to remain proportionally accurate, which means that it shows the true size of Africa in comparison to a much smaller North America. So it forces the viewer to sort of confront these assumptions that we have about geography and power. And it really emphasizes part of a world that is often disregarded by the Western world because it's given this classification of third world because of a lower economic status, but it also causes the viewer to consider the exploitation of the poor by the wealthy, or perhaps of the non-Western world by the Western world. On the other side of these light boxes are photos of farmers, shipping containers that the waste was transported in, and different residents of Koko. And as you can see on the right side of the screen here, the photos are reflected back by mirrors that hang on the wall of the installation space. So when you're standing on the map side, you can still see the photos reflected back at you. Now, sometimes these mirrors are broken, and he changes the placement some. So, depending on the viewer's physical location in relation to the installation, the light box, the mirrors, it sort of changes how how the image is perceived. Excuse me, and it brings into question how our stance on things determines how we perceive or interpret certain images or messages, and how we choose to or not to see certain things. Really brings up the idea of perspective, I think, not seeing or not getting the entire picture because of our own physical or mental stance. A second installation space of this work included 8-foot tall photos of children scavenging in the cocoa dump, which is where a lot of that waste probably would have ended up, as well as this serves just as a general acknowledgement of both the humanity and the poverty that exists within cocoa, Nigeria. The final space of this installation has 55-gallon barrels. Now, these are not the actual 55-gallon barrels of toxic waste. Instead, they are filled with water. The barrels themselves are black, and so the combination of that dark color and the water creates this highly reflective surface. And then there are light boxes that are suspended above them that project photos of the people from cocoa. And so, in a way, this sort of places those people inside these drums of toxic waste, at least figuratively speaking. So as a whole, this work explores ideas of limitation and distortion, of reflection, of dark and light, and really it is an idea given tangible form. This is a physical manifestation of the poor people of cocoa paying the price of first world decisions. It's attention grabbing and larger than life, and a piece that really communicates the horrors of this event and provokes a sort of intense contemplation within the viewer. And so Jaar is using a variety of things, a variety of forms and objects to convey his concept. But let's also look at how artists can create conceptual unity within a single image. We discussed a continuous narrative a bit earlier, and that's similar to what's happening here. This is Hans Memling's Nativity. He was a Northern Renaissance artist, and for those who are familiar with Christianity, this will be a familiar, sort of easily recognizable nativity scene, right? But how has the artist taken various visual parts and combined them together to get his concept across? So all of the components from various parts of the story are assembled together in a single scene, and it creates conceptual unity. We have our major characters of the story, Mary and Joseph, sort of kneeling here with the newborn Jesus Christ. The story says that baby Jesus is born in a barn or a stable, in a manger, right? Though this building is not really a barn. It's more of the ruins of a contemporary 15th century building, which serves a few purposes. One, to allow the 15th century viewer to sort of relate on a more personal level with the work and the story, but also to reference the idea of Christ's birth and subsequent crucifixion and death. The idea that that will do away with the old law and bring in the new. Now in the background we also have, you can see an ox and a donkey. The ox is meant to be representative of the Gentiles, while the donkey represents the Jews. And both of these groups are here recognizing the newborn holy child. Near the top, here, sort of in the center, we also have these golden rays of light that kind of come down. You can trace them down to sort of shine down on the presence of the Holy Spirit. And then we also have rays that emanate from Mary's head in sort of a halo that symbolize her holiness. And we could also think of this as a reference to the Immaculate Conception, in which the Virgin Mary becomes pregnant with Jesus. So Memling here has taken all of these elements from various parts of the entire story, which begins with Mary's Immaculate Conception all the way to the birth of Jesus here, and combined them together into a single composition to convey a unified concept. Now, variety, on the other hand, variety is the spice of life. It provides interest, and it can serve to invigorate or enliven an artwork or a design. Variety can refer to a diversity of ideas, elements, or media within a work of art. So here we have Robert Rauschenberg's monogram from 1955-59, and this work is quite varied. We have a stuffed goat inside a tire, which stands on a painting, and then the goat also has painting on its face. So we have a variety of forms, colors, and textures here, which provide visual interest and really provokes contemplation from the viewer. And a variety of media. He's combining the traditions of painting and sculpture here, and creating sort of a direct affront to traditional artistic conventions and morals. Now, we also have unity, perhaps unity of color. We have this sort of neutral color palette with browns and blacks and grays throughout, although variety in color as well, with the pops of red throughout. Unity of line and shape as well. So what does this work mean? Is there a conceptual unity here? It's sort of ambiguous, kind of secretive. Really, you would have had to know the artist to sort of understand this work. Your book says, by combining these objects, Rauschenberg has created an outlandish symbol of himself as a rebel and outcast. The goat has sort of long been a symbol of male lust, but it could also be a symbol of Christian wayward souls. And so perhaps here it symbolizes Rauschenberg's own sort of controversial behaviors, referring to his violation of art conventions, though he was also a gay man in the 50s, so probably referring to those quote-unquote controversial behaviors as well. The goat is physically penetrating this tire, and then stands kind of dominantly on top of the painted canvas, so kind of a symbol of the established art world. And then you can't tell from this view, but the goat also actually defecates a dirty tennis ball onto the painting, so a pretty clear message there, I would say. Artists can also create visual harmony or unity through the use of variety, by using a variety of shapes, colors, values, etc. So one way to do that is by imposing a grid or some other form of underlying visual structural system. For example, we're looking at a Baltimore albumen quilt, and this would apply to plenty of other quilts as well, though this one is used in your book. We have this carefully arranged design that uses a variety of images fused together into a unified whole because of this strong grid-like structure that determines the arrangement of the different shapes across the quilt and creates this sense of order and cohesion. So the principle of balance refers to a way of combining elements to add a feeling of equilibrium or stability to a work. Visual balance works very similarly to physical balance, so it might help to think of it in that way. So first we have symmetrical balance. If a work can be cut in half and each side look almost exactly the same, then it is symmetrically balanced. So with symmetrical balance, the forms of a composition mirror each other across a central axis. For example, the human body is near perfectly symmetrical, so symmetry seems pretty natural to us when we create things or when we view things. So we're looking at a couple of ritual containers called gua from China. These are from the late Shang dynasty, so from about 1600 to 1050 BCE. And these both depict a creature born of symmetry, a Tao Tiwi, a monster that is so gluttonous it devours itself. So this image is meant as a warning against overindulgence as a ritual container used in probably a ceremonial or maybe a festival kind of situation. Warning the user of the sin of overindulgence, right? Or of gluttony. And so the form of the creature here is sort of hidden amongst these very symmetrical shapes and forms that kind of create the monster. We have sort of a pair of symmetrical eyes on either side of this central axis here. And then the patterns mirrored on either side signify horns, claws, fangs, ears, and other smaller creatures. The Taj Mahal in India is another great example of symmetrical balance or symmetry. It's thought to be completely symmetrical except for the most interior tombs. The Taj Mahal was commissioned by the fifth Mughal emperor of India. He commissioned it as a memorial for his third most beloved wife. And he designed it with a visual perfection to honor her memory. He wanted it to stand as a testament to the transcendent power of timeless love, as well as a recognition of love and expression of admiration. Now, symmetry typically connotes permanence and stability. It's quite easy to take in, and it suggests a pleasing tranquility, order, perfection, as well as associations of sort of ideal beauty. Architects often employ symmetrical balance to give a sense of unity and grandeur to a building's facade or its face. And here, even the reflecting pool and the landscape mimic the symmetry of the buildings and the minarets, or these tall, slender towers here. The Taj Mahal also employs radial symmetry or radial balance. This is achieved when all elements in a work are equidistant from a central point and repeat symmetrically from side to side and top to bottom. Now, this is not necessarily have to be round or circular in shape. It can apply to any geometric shape, really. More than one line of symmetry crossing through a central point is essentially what it boils down to. And Islamic architecture does this so well. The Taj Mahal's main building and adjacent Mughal garden use radial balance. You can see here the sort of plan of the garden in which everything is equidistant from this central point and kind of is divided by more than one line of symmetry that runs through it. And that can be said for this as well, I think. or rather the pool is more of symmetrical balance, but anyway. So in an Islamic mosque, abstract geometric forms are typically favored. Designs that are based on mathematical shapes and forms are thought to encourage spiritual contemplation, but images that depict living things are associated with idolatry. So instead, the interior of the mosque is decorated with these complex, symmetrically and radially balanced geometric designs. These can be on the walls or on the ceilings, but typically it creates this impression of a sort of unending repetition, which is meant to communicate the infinite nature of Allah. Mandalas are another great example of radial balance or symmetry. These are sacred diagrams of the universe that often involve squares and circles sort of set within each other. This one is a Tibetan sand painted mandala. It's a series of symbols that's sort of equidistant from the center here. The colors vary and the shapes point in 4 different directions from the center. So we have a sort of balance of variety and unity here. We can also have asymmetrical balance, which sounds sort of contradictory, but really it just means that the entire composition is visually balanced, but it's not exactly the same on both sides. For example, here we have Pietro della Francesca's The Flagellation from 1469. And this work is unified, but asymmetrically balanced. So we have 5 figures on the left here, but 3 figures on the right. However, the 3 figures on the right are larger, because they're closer to the viewer, than the figures on the left. So the difference in number is balanced out. The 2 groups of figures have similar visual weights, so even though the composition isn't exactly the same on both sides, it's still balanced. In Gustav Klimt's Death and Life, asymmetrical balance dramatizes the opposition between life, here on the right side, with this sort of billowing form of light-hued patterns and peaceful, slumbering human figures that interact with one another, and death to the left, a similar billowing form, but singular, thinner, a sort of dark skeletal presence. Now this composition recalls what's called the medieval Dance of Death, which was illustrated as a skeletal being holding a scythe or an hourglass, so like the Grim Reaper, which was indicative of someone's time being up. And so the figure, death, has come to reap their soul. So here we have this clump of figures suggesting sort of multiple generations. We have young, old, middle-aged figures, but they're in this dreamy state of bright colors and flowers, perhaps communicative of growth or renewal, which would work with the idea of generations here. Whereas in contrast with Death on the left, in his dark, somber colors and sort of geometrically designed cloak, communicative of this idea that death comes for everyone. The 2 halves of the painting here are actually linked, if you notice this lone figure with her eyes open here, staring back at death. She's the only one awake and the only one who's noticed his presence, and she seems to ask, are you here for me? And he's like, yes, I am. So this connection really sort of pulls our attention and serves to connect the 2 halves of the painting.